The courtroom was full that day, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath. It wasn't just another ordinary hearing. There was something in the air. Something heavy and electric, as if everyone could sense that something unusual was about to happen. The long wooden benches were lined with people. Some were family members of those involved in the case. Some were reporters eager to write their next big headline, and others were simply curious faces who had come to watch. The ceiling was high, and the walls were lined with tall shelves filled with old law books. Their spines faded from years of use. The smell of polished wood and paper mixed together, giving the place a serious, almost intimidating feeling. The judge's bench stood at the far end, raised above the rest of the room. It was a large, sturdy desk made from dark oak, and behind it sat the judge, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm expression that revealed nothing. She wore the traditional black robe, and her hair was neatly tied back, not a strand out of place. Every movement she made was controlled and precise, the kind that showed she had spent years commanding the respect of the room at the front. Near the judge's bench sat the lawyers for both sides. They had piles of documents, notes, and files stacked in front of them, flipping through pages and whispering to each other in low voices. Their suits were neat, their expressions serious, but you could tell they were alert, ready for anything. The sound of shuffling papers, soft coughs, and the occasional squeak of a chair were the only noises breaking the silence. Even the air felt thick, as though it was pressing down on everyone in the room. The boy sat quietly in the witness stand, small hands folded tightly together in his lap. He couldn't have been more than 11 or 12 years old. His eyes moved slowly around the room, studying every corner, every person. There was a nervous energy about him, the kind you feel when you know you're about to say something important but aren't sure how the world will react. His feet dangled above the floor, not quite reaching it, and he kept tapping one shoe against the wooden stand without realizing it. From where he sat, he could see everyone, the lawyers, the people in the gallery, the court officers standing near the doors, and, most importantly, the judge. He stared at her longer than most people would dare. She was the most important person in the room, the one who could decide his future. Yet, there was something about her that made his chest feel tight. Something familiar he couldn't quite explain. The audience behind him watched in silence. Some were leaning forward, their elbows resting on their knees, eyes locked on the boy. Others sat back but still watched closely, curious about what would happen next. The reporters were ready, their pens hovering over their notepads. It felt like the entire room was waiting for a moment they didn't yet understand, but knew would be important. The judge adjusted her glasses, glanced at some papers on her desk, and then looked directly at the boy. "Please state your name." "For the record," she said in a steady voice. It wasn't harsh, but it carried authority. The boy's lips parted, and he answered softly, his voice barely carrying across the room. A few people in the back leaned forward to hear better. There was a pause, the kind that seemed to stretch longer than it really was. The judge studied the boy, her expression unreadable, while he kept his gaze fixed on her face. The air grew heavier, and even the smallest movements, the scratch of a pen, the creak of a wooden bench, felt louder than they should have. The boy's breathing quickened, though he tried to hide it. In that stillness, something invisible seemed to pass. Between them, a flicker of recognition, a strange tension that no one else noticed yet. The boy's fingers tightened around each other. His heart thudded in his chest, and though he didn't know how or why, he felt that whatever happened next was going to change everything. The court officer standing near the door glanced toward the gallery, as if expecting someone to suddenly speak up or make a noise, but no one did. Every person in that room was caught in the same spell, watching, waiting, holding their breath. The judge gave a small nod for the boy to continue, her eyes never leaving his face. Somewhere in the back of the room, A chair creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. The boy could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, yet his attention stayed locked on the woman in the black robe. Something deep inside him told him that this wasn't just another day in court. And in that moment, before the words that would shake the entire courtroom, time seemed to slow, and everyone could feel it. They were about to witness something extraordinary. Marcus had never known what it felt like to belong somewhere. Since he was a baby, his life had been a restless journey from one foster home to another, like a suitcase passed from hand to hand. Some homes were kind, some were cold, but none ever felt permanent. He learned early on that nothing stayed the same for long, not the faces, not the houses, not even the rules. He could remember small details from each place he had lived. The smell of cinnamon bread from Mrs. Taylor's kitchen. The sound of old country music from Mr. Roberts' truck. The creaky floor in the upstairs hallway at the Miller's house. But none of these memories were strong enough to feel like home. They were just fragments, pieces of a life that never quite fit together. Marcus had been told bits and pieces about his past, but never the whole story. Caseworkers would offer short explanations in soft voices, as if speaking gently would make the truth hurt less. Your mother loved you very much, one social worker had said, but she couldn't take care of you. That was the line he heard the most over and over, until it stopped sounding like words and started feeling like an excuse. Still, there was one thing Marcus held on to. A small, worn-out photograph. It was old, the edges curled, and the colors fading in it. A woman smiled at the camera while holding a tiny baby wrapped in a blanket. She had kind eyes and a warm smile, and even though Marcus had no memory of her, he kept that picture hidden in his backpack. Whenever life felt too heavy, he would take it out, trace her face with his fingertip, and whisper, "One day, I'll find you." Growing up in foster care had made Marcus cautious. He didn't open up to people easily, and he learned to hide his feelings behind a quiet, careful manner. But deep inside, there was a small spark that refused to go out to believe that somewhere out there, someone was waiting for him. That belief was the only thing that kept him from giving up completely. When Marcus was moved into his last foster home, he was already older than most kids who got adopted. At his age, he knew the chances were low. People usually wanted babies, or very young children, not a boy who was almost a teenager. Still, he tried to keep his head down, follow the rules, and stay out of trouble. But deep down, he still dreamed of a reunion, though he had no idea how it could ever happen. Life in that final home was quiet. The family was kind but distant, treating Marcus politely but without the warmth he craved. They provided food, clothes, and shelter, but they didn't offer the one thing he longed for most: love. Every night, he would stare at the ceiling and imagine a voice calling his name, a pair of arms wrapping around him, and the feeling of finally being safe. What Marcus didn't know was that fate was quietly moving pieces behind the scenes. A case was about to come up in court, one that would require his presence as a witness. It wasn't about his adoption or his past, at least. That's what everyone thought. But life has a strange way of leading people exactly where they need to be. When he was told he would have to appear before a judge, Marcus didn't think much of it. He imagined a serious man in a robe, asking him a few questions, and then sending him home. But the moment he stepped into that courtroom, something in the air felt different. The wall seemed taller, the room colder, and his heart began to beat faster, not because he was scared of the law, but because something deep inside him whispered, "Pay attention." He didn't yet know why. He didn't yet understand what was about to happen. But the boy who had spent his whole life searching was about to stand face to face with the answer he had been waiting for. Marcus had always known. There were pieces of his life missing, pieces that no one seemed willing to explain. People told him stories about his past, but they were always incomplete, like a puzzle with too many gaps. He didn't know the name of the hospital where he was born. He didn't know the reason his mother had to give him up. He didn't even know if she was still alive. All he had were whispers from the past. And a photograph so worn it looked as though it had survived 100 storms. The official records about his birth were locked away, sealed by law. Confidential, the caseworkers would say, their voices polite but final, as if that single word was supposed to close the conversation. Marcus didn't understand why finding out the truth was such a crime. Wasn't it his life? Wasn't it his story? Why was he the only one who couldn't read the ending? Over the years, he had tried to piece together the clues. Sometimes, an old foster parent would accidentally mention something, a name, a place, a date, and Marcus would tuck it away in his memory. He had a small notebook hidden under his mattress, where he scribbled down anything that might help him someday. Tall woman, brown hair, green eyes. Worked at a bookstore. Lived near a church. He didn't know if these details were real or just stories passed from one person to another. But he collected them like treasure. Then came the day that changed everything. Marcus had been called to court as part of a routine case. It had nothing to do with his search for his mother war, so he thought. The people who escorted him into the courtroom didn't seem to know that they were guiding him toward the most important moment of his life. He sat in the witness stand, trying to stay calm, but his eyes kept drifting toward the woman sitting high above everyone else, the judge. At first, it was just a glance. Judges were important people, after all. But then, the second time his eyes met hers, something strange happened. A flicker of recognition, a quiet spark deep in his chest. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop looking at her. It was as if his mind was trying to remind him of something his memory had forgotten. Her face was strong yet gentle, framed by neatly tied back hair. But it wasn't just her appearance, it was something about the way she looked at him. Her eyes lingered a moment too long, as if she too was searching for something she couldn't name. Marcus felt a strange pull, like he was standing at the edge of a secret that had been waiting for him his whole life. In that moment, tiny details started to stand out to him. The curve of her smile when she spoke, the shape of her hands resting on the desk, even the way her voice sounded when she addressed the lawyers. Something about it all was familiar. And then, without warning, his mind flashed an image, her face from the old photograph in his backpack. The same eyes, the same smile. Marcus blinked, his heart pounding. No, it couldn't be. It was impossible. But the more he looked, the harder it became to convince himself otherwise. That old picture he'd carried for years was suddenly no longer just a memory, was alive, breathing and sitting right there in front of him. Still, he said nothing. Not yet. He wasn't sure if it was hope playing tricks on him, or if fate had truly brought him to this moment. All he knew was that something inside him had shifted. The courtroom, the case, the lawyers, none of it mattered anymore. There was only one question now. Could the woman in the black robe really be his mother? Marcus sat in the witness stand, but he wasn't really hearing the questions anymore. His ears picked up sounds, papers shuffling, chairs creaking, someone coughing softly in the gallery, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. He was staring at the judge again, unable to help himself. Every second he looked at her, something inside him grew louder, like a quiet voice that had been whispering for years but was finally starting to shout. It wasn't just that she looked like the woman in the photograph, it was deeper than that. 'Twas the way her eyes softened for the briefest moment when they met his. It was the way her voice seemed to carry warmth beneath the authority. And it was the strange feeling that, even though they had never met, she already knew him. Marcus tried to shake it off. He told himself he was being foolish. People saw resemblances all the time, it didn't mean anything. Maybe he was just desperate to see his mother in every kind face he came across. But then, there was the way her gaze lingered. Judges were supposed to stay neutral, to look at everyone the same way. But when her eyes found his, there was a tiny flicker like a candle struggling to stay lit, told him she was feeling something, too. The lawyer beside him cleared his throat, drawing Marcus's attention back to the case. He answered a question automatically, his voice steady but his thoughts still racing. How could he be sure? How could he know without asking? He remembered the photograph again, the faint creases, the faded colors, the smile frozen in time. In the picture, the woman was holding him close, just a tiny baby wrapped in a blanket. Her hair was the same dark brown, her eyes the same shade, and even the small curve of her lips seemed to match perfectly. His hand twitched at his side, as if he wanted to reach for that photo right now, just to be certain. Marcus felt his heartbeat pick up speed. Every part of him was telling him to speak, to just blurt out the question that had been burning inside his chest since the moment he stepped into the room. But fear held him back. What if he was wrong? What if he embarrassed himself in front of all these people? What if the truth turned out to be something he didn't want to hear? And yet, what if he was right? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. If he was right, it meant the woman who had haunted his dreams for years was sitting just a few feet away from him. It meant the endless searching, the questions, the wondering. It could all end here. He looked at her again, this time more boldly. For a split second, their eyes locked, and in that moment, Marcus felt it not just in his mind, but in his bones. Recognition, connection. Something so strong it almost made him forget where he was. He gripped the sides of the witness stand, his knuckles turning white. The weight of the moment pressed on him, growing heavier by the second. He could feel the words forming on his tongue, pushing to be spoken. His chest rose and fell faster, the air in the courtroom suddenly feeling too thick. He didn't know it yet, but he was just seconds away from saying something that would freeze the entire room. The lawyers would stop mid-sentence. The court officers would stiffen. The people in the gallery would gasp. All it would take was one sentence. The question came, but Marcus didn't hear it. The lawyer's voice was just a low hum somewhere far away. His heart was pounding so hard it almost drowned out every other sound in the room. His palms were sweaty, and his throat felt tight. But he knew deep down that he couldn't hold it in any longer. The truth, or at least what he believed was the truth, was clawing its way out of him. For a moment, he just stared at the judge. Her expression was calm, professional, exactly what you'd expect from someone sitting in that seat. But her eyes, those eyes betrayed her. They flickered with something soft, something unsure, something human. It was the kind of look a stranger wouldn't notice, but Marcus caught it. Because it wasn't the look of a judge. It was the look of a mother who had just recognized her child. The room was quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that comes before a storm, heavy and waiting. Marcus felt it pressing down on him from every side. He glanced briefly at the crowd behind him, rows of people leaning forward, curious, impatient for the next move. He saw the lawyers waiting, the court officers standing like statues, the reporters with their pens ready to capture something worth printing. His lips parted. The words trembled at the edge, fighting against the fear that told him to keep silent. For years, he had wanted this moment to see her, speak to her, but now that it was here, it felt almost too big to handle. And then, without another thought, it happened. "You're my mother." The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They cut through the stillness of the room like glass shattering on a marble floor. For half a second, there was no reaction, just silence, so sharp it made the air feel colder. Then it happened. Gasps. Dozens of them. The sound rose from the gallery like a wave, washing over the courtroom. A pen dropped from a reporter's. hand hitting the floor with a sharp clink. One of the lawyers froze mid-step, his mouth half open. The court officer near the door stiffened, his eyes darting between the boy and the judge. The judge's gavel slipped from her hand and landed on the desk with a dull thud, the echo rolling through the room. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She just stared at Marcus, her eyes wide. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and recognition. Marcus's voice had been steady when he spoke, but now his hands trembled. He didn't know what would happen next. Would she deny it? Would she tell him he was wrong? Or would she tell him the thing he had been hoping to hear his entire life? The room seemed to shrink around them. In that moment, it didn't matter that there were 50 other people watching. It didn't matter that she was wearing a black robe and he was sitting in a witness stand. The space between them was no longer a courtroom, it was something far more personal. For Marcus, time slowed. He saw every small movement in perfect clarity, the way her fingers tightened against the edge of the bench, the way her chest rose as she took in a slow, careful breath, the way a single tear threatened to fall, but didn't single quotes. And though no one said a word, every person in that courtroom could feel it. Something had just been revealed that would change both of their lives forever. For a long, breathless moment, the judge didn't move. The words hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck, the sound still ringing silently inside her head. "You're my mother." She had heard thousands of things in her courtroom confessions, lies, pleas for mercy, but nothing had ever hit her like that. She gripped the edge of her bench, feeling the smooth, polished wood under her fingers. Her knuckles turned white. She tried to steady her breathing, but her chest felt tight, as if every breath had to push through years of buried memories. She couldn't look away from the boy in front of her, no matter how much her training told her she should. Judges were supposed to remain calm, neutral, unaffected. But right now, she wasn't sure she could even remember what neutral felt like. Her eyes darted over his face, tracing every detail, the curve of his jaw, the shape of his nose, the way his eyes seemed both cautious and hopeful at the same time. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. She could see flashes of the baby she once held, the tiny hands that had gripped her finger, the soft weight she had rocked to sleep on countless sleepless nights. The memories came without warning. She was young again, holding him in a small apartment with thin walls and peeling paint. She could almost hear his laugh, high and pure, the sound that had once been her entire reason for waking up in the morning. And then came the part she tried so hard not to remember, the day she had to let him go. She had been given no choice. Back then, her life was falling apart. No money, no family support. She had been told over and over that it was best for him, that someone else could give him the life she couldn't. She had signed the papers with shaking hands, her tears smudging the ink. The adoption records were sealed, and she had been told to move on, but she never did. She carried his memory like a shadow that followed her everywhere, and now he was here, in her courtroom, speaking words she had dreamed of hearing but never believed she would. The judge's throat tightened. She blinked rapidly, fighting the sting in her eyes. She could feel the attention of every person in the room pressing on her, waiting to see what she would do. She was supposed to maintain control, but her heart was pulling her in a completely different direction. For a moment, she thought about denying it just to protect him, to protect herself, to protect the dignity of the court. But as she looked at him, she knew she couldn't lie. To him, not to those eyes that mirrored her own. She swallowed hard. Her voice caught somewhere between her role as a judge and her identity as a mother. We need to take a recess," she said, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard it in that courtroom. She banged the gavel once, not to show authority, but to end a moment that was too raw, too personal, to play out in front of strangers as she rose from her seat. Their eyes met again. In that shared look, everything was said without a single word. Years of loss, a lifetime of longing, and the fragile hope that this wasn't just a chance encounter, but the beginning of something new. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet. But it was the kind of quiet that buzzed with unspoken words. The judge walked slowly, her black robe swaying with each step. She didn't go straight to her chambers. As usual, she needed a moment. Her heart was still racing, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Marcus sat on a wooden bench near the side wall, his legs swinging nervously. A court officer had brought him out during the recess, but instead of escorting him back to his foster family, they had been told to wait. He didn't know what was coming next. He only knew that he had said if he had finally spoken the words he'd been carrying inside him for years. And now, every second felt like an eternity. When the judge finally stepped into the hallway, she paused for a moment before approaching him. Without the towering bench between them, she seemed differently less like an untouchable figure of authority, and more like a person. Her eyes, usually sharp and commanding, were softer now, but they were also searching, scanning his face the way you search for something precious you thought was lost forever. "Marcus," she said quietly, as if tasting his name for the first time. His head jerked up. You know my name," he said. Surprised, her lips trembled into a faint smile. "I've known it before today," she admitted. Then she took a deep breath, as if steadying herself for something that had waited too long. "I am your mother." The words hit him like sunlight breaking through clouds. For a second, he couldn't breathe. His mind tried to hold on to them, turning them over again and again, afraid they might disappear if he blinked. She sat down beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out but stopped just short of touching him. "I didn't leave you because I wanted to," she said. "I fought to keep you. But I was young, alone, and they told me I couldn't give you the life you deserved. I thought letting you go would give you a chance. It was the hardest thing I have ever done." Marcus swallowed hard, blinking fast to stop the tears threatening to spill. "I looked for you," he whispered, "all my life. I thought, maybe you were gone, or you didn't want me." Her eyes filled instantly. "I have wanted you every single day. I've imagined this moment 1,000 times, but I never thought it would actually happen." There was a pause long enough for them to just look at each other, memorizing every detail. She took a slow breath. "The adoption records were sealed. I couldn't find you, even though I tried. And then, fate brought you into my courtroom." The court officer, standing at a respectful distance, looked away, giving them a bubble of privacy. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something he couldn't quite name, like the missing piece of himself had suddenly been placed back where it belonged. "I don't care about the past," he said softly. I don't want to lose you again." Her hand finally closed over his, warm and steady. "You won't," she promised. In that hallway, far from the gavel's echo and the courtrooms, Rule's mother and son began the first chapter of a story they both thought they'd never get to write. The rest of the hearing never happened, at least, not in the way anyone had planned. The judge, no longer just a judge, recused herself from the case, citing a personal conflict. But to Marcus, it wasn't personal conflict. It was destiny. It was the moment his life split in two, before and after. Weeks passed, but not in silence. For the first time, Marcus had someone who called him every evening just to ask how his day went. Someone who wanted to know if he'd eaten, if he'd done his homework, if he was happy. It was strange at first having someone care about the little details of his life, but it felt good. It felt right. Finally, the day came when they met again. This time, not in a courtroom, but in a small park near the city. The air smelled faintly of fresh grass, and the late afternoon sun cast golden light over everything. Marcus sat on a bench, clutching the same old photograph he had carried for years. The edges now even more worn from being held so often. She walked toward him slowly, wearing a simple dress instead of a robe. Without the black cloth and the heavy bench between them, she seemed lighter, more human, more his. When she reached him, she knelt down so their eyes were level. No titles, no barriers, just a mother looking at her son. "Hi," she said softly, almost shyly. Marcus's lips curled into a smile he couldn't hide. "Hi." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, almost at the same time, they reached for each other. The hug was awkward at first. 12 years of distance doesn't vanish instantly, but then it deepened. Her arms wrapped tightly around him, and his small frame leaned into her as if it had always belonged there. He could hear her heartbeat, quick but steady, and he realized it was the first time he had ever heard it in real life. She kissed the top of his head and whispered, "You're home now." They sat together on the bench for hours, talking about everything and nothing. She told him stories about when he was a baby, how he used to grip her fingers so tightly she thought he'd never let go. He told her about his favorite books, the places he'd lived, and the time he'd gotten in trouble at school for defending another kid. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They laughed, they cried, and somewhere in between, the years they had lost seemed to fade. Not gone, but no longer sharp enough to cut. For Marcus, it wasn't about the grand reunion or the gasps in the courtroom anymore. It was about this moment sitting next to the person he had searched for his entire life. Finally knowing that she wasn't a dream or a face in a photograph. She was real. She was here. And she was his mother. As they left the park, hand in hand, the world around them felt different, brighter, warmer, and full of new beginnings. This wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning.